Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on the Industrial Revolution here in AP World History Modern Unit 5, 1750 to 1900. So, in this lecture, we're just going to look at the Industrial Revolution in its most basic terms and highlight a lot of the key information and key events and processes and so forth. And we'll let the activities and things that we do kind of fill in the blanks and expound upon the main details of this subject. All right, so let's get started. So one thing that we think about when we think about the word revolution, we always think of a war, but really you have to ask yourself the question: does it always mean war? Because we've talked about other revolutions in the past, like the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, which they weren't wars; they were just changes. And the Industrial Revolution is one of these types of revolutions. It has both short and long term effects, just like those revolutions that actually take place or have warfare, like the American or the French revolutions, or the Haitian or the Latin. So, another thing that you have to consider, specifically when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, is how did certain technological discoveries and developments of the scientific revolution actually change society? Because if you look back towards the scientific revolution, this actually kind of helps set up some of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So you have to think of what kinds of discoveries and inventions and innovations were made and what things happened that helped kind of start the Industrial Revolution. And again, keep this in mind as an example of something that you could use for synthesis or greater understanding or complex understanding if you're writing, let's say, a DBQ or a long essay question. All right, so let's get started with the revolution. And we have to really talk about what's going on in Europe during the 18th century. In the 1700s, we see that the European societies, the main ones are based on mercantilism and really capitalism. And labor is very, very intensive. And you start to see that the lasting effects of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment in certain actions, such as warfare, because of the French Revolution, because of the Napoleonic period, do lead to more change and do lead to more peace. And what we see through all of the stuff being added together, you see the Industrial Revolution. And it's a period that's going to be defined by an increased output of goods made by machines and other inventions. Now, it's going to be slow at first, and it's going to be uneven, and it's going to go only to certain places, and then it's going to take off in other areas and hurt other areas and so forth. But eventually, it's going to explode. And it's going to be almost overnight once that actually does happen. But again, that's at the end of this period, and we'll talk more about what that actually is in the next units of AP World History. All right, so let's talk about some factors that helped aid industrial growth. One is you have changes in farming. You have the enclosure movement, which is basically the process of taking over land and fencing it off, where it was generally used to be shared or like a land of commons for the peasant farmers. And you end up having larger fields, which means you have more output. But the problem with that is it ends up in hurting small farmers, which they in turn become displaced and they have to go somewhere to survive, and they end up moving to the cities. And you start to see a movement of at least the small farmers to the cities. You also have crop rotation, and we've talked about crop rotation before in this course and in previous world history courses. And you start to see the use of the same amount of land but being able to produce more crops because of the rotation itself, plus improved technology, as we'll see later. You also see improved livestock. Development of selective breeding processes means that you have better weights and better quantities of livestock in the 17th century and the 18th century and through to the 19th and so forth. All right, number two is you have an energy revolution, the use of coal. And coal is going to help power the first steam engine. And this is very important because you have an energy source that is going to become very, very vital in this revolution. And we'll talk about many different ways and why this is vital, and this will come up all the time. But one person that you need to know for the sake of coal and the steam engine is James Watt, because he's the person that created the first pump to remove water out of coal mines, which meant specifically in England, you could actually get to a greater source of this coal, and it helped fuel the process even more. And one of the things that you're going to see based on these two things are the development of rail lines and railroads across Britain and then Europe and then specifically North America, where it's really going to take off because of the size of that continent. And all this is going to do is going to encourage travel, it's going to encourage movement, it's going to encourage trade. All right, so let's talk about Britain. And you guys are probably going to get tired of answering this same question, is why was Britain where the Industrial Revolution began? Because it's going to come up a lot this week. And we have to think about why. And Britain has many advantages, and you can see them on screen. One's manpower. They had a significant population. They're going through a boom. You have those small farmers being basically forced off lands. They're going to cities. You have a readily supply of workers. They have materials. They're rich in natural resources, specifically the resources that are going to be a huge part of the Industrial Revolution, coal and iron ore, as well as others. They have a lot of money. There's trade and war and investment going on that they have the ability to use that for. Because remember, they have a large amount of colonies over the globe. They're going to, not as much as they're going to have here moving through this century and beyond, but they still have a huge influence across the globe from a money standpoint and because of a market standpoint leading in together. And then next is modes of transportation. They have significant road networks. Railways are being significantly invested upon because of that use of money and access to money. And then Britain being an island, and they have the strongest navy in the world, they have huge access to shipping and a better shipping network than anybody in the world at the time. All right, so the British also revolutionized the textile industry. The textile industry is going to be that beginning industry in the Industrial Revolution. So when you first start talking about the Industrial Revolution, start learning about it, what's the industry that gets affected first? We always really focus on the textile industry first. And it's because all the inventions that actually were developed either during this period or just before built off of each other, from the flying shuttle all the way to the cotton gin that was invented by Eli Whitney. So now, the other thing with this is these inventions were also too expensive to produce just for home use. So there had to be something that would actually have to be used or developed to actually employ these machines. And this is where you get factories. So you start to see the factory system develop because of these inventions, because of this need for things, and because of these investment opportunities, you get the factory. And what ultimately you'll see because of these inventions, because of the factory, you're going to see an increased production of cotton and other textiles in just a 50-year period, 60-year period. You can see on screen, look at how much more you're able, just in England, they're able to produce, because of the technology increase. All right, now we need to talk about the economic effects of the Industrial Revolution. One, you see goods are being produced more efficiently. We can see that with just the production increase, looking back on the last slide with textiles and cotton. You have two, supplies of goods are increasing. If you're producing more efficiently, you're going to have more supply. Three, if you have more supply, the prices are going to go down. Four, you're actually going to have higher demand from the consumer at all levels if prices are going down because they can afford it. It's more readily available to them. And then number five, jobs are created in factories and on rail lines to help sustain this system, whether it's production or to keep things the transportation network going so things can get to market. And then six, you have social changes. And we're going to look at all these in more detail throughout the activities and so forth that we do in this unit. But you guys make sure you come back to this slide. It's very important. All right. Now, the social effect of the revolution. The first is urbanization. You have the movement of people to cities. Now, the big question here is, did people really choose to come to cities? It's a good question, and it's a complicated answer because some did choose to come to cities and others didn't. You have to think about in terms of the demand for workers, the pay that was being offered in factories, and then realistically, the one where you're really forced, the people that are forced to come to cities, think of those small farmers. They get pushed off their land because of enclosure acts and so forth, and they have to make a living. So what do? They move to where work is, and that's in the cities. Now, here's some negatives on this. Is one is overcrowding. You can see that there in Manchester, as an example, in England, they had about 17,000 people in 1750. 50 years later, they have 70,000. And think about how fast that is, how fast of growth that is from just a 50-year period in one town. But overcrowding wasn't just a problem in terms of just, hey, that example of Manchester. It led to dirty cities, disease, whether it was in the factories or the streets. You had fire hazards. Governments become corrupt and inefficient because they've grown too quick and there's too much power linked into the actual factories. And cities are clearly unsafe. And one of the things that actually is, even though it's nice to actually have in terms of housing, but also leads to some of the more problems, is the tenement housing. These are very shabby built apartment buildings. There's no light, there's no running water. Most of them only have access to one room, where you have families of 6 or 7 or even more that might only be in one room. So that causes even further issues. And there's no real sanitation system. So you take all these negatives, you do have some problems with urbanization, especially on social life. Number 2 is you have the hazards of factory life. If you look here, you have long work hours. Most often you can see people are working on average 12 to 16 hours a day. There's no safety devices, so it's not very uncommon for people to suffer loss of limbs or even their lives, or be injured if they didn't lose anything quite a bit, and they're not being paid given severance or anything like that, or benefits if they are injured. There's pollution. You start seeing coal dust getting into and other things getting into the air, and it gets into the lungs of workers. So you start seeing disease become an issue and breathing problems. Women are paid less than men, so the wage gaps there, especially also children are paid less than men. So you start to see over time women and children are being hired over men because employers can pay them less, and also because they thought they'd adapt to machinery a lot easier. They're a lot easier to manage, and so forth. And all what this does is it causes problems within the social structure of the family life, where families are torn apart or they barely see each other, and causes a lot of problems. Next one is children. I already mentioned this a little bit, but children start to suffer specifically in the mills and the mines, and they start to have problems. You see children put into really bad positions, such as acting as trappers in ventilation shafts, working long hours. They're obviously not getting education. You're seeing, because of the poor conditions in factories, there's many children that actually get orphaned during this time, so they work for only food and board, not necessarily money, which means they can be taken advantage of a little bit more because they're desperate. And then also you just see families struggling because of this new lifestyle. They need to put their children into the factories just so they can live and survive as a family, even though they're not necessarily seeing each other. You see beatings and brutal conditions for children especially. And then there is one positive out of this. In England, it was the Factory Act of 1833, which made it mandatory for children that they could only work 8 hours a day maximum, and they had to be at least 13 years of age. So at least there was a little silver lining, a positive later on in this area. All right, now another social effect that's more of a positive is we do see a rise of the middle class, or at least the expansion of the middle class. You see factory owners become more prevalent, shippers become more prevalent because they have to ship or transport the goods, as well as merchants for the same reasons. They're selling those goods. You start to see development of better housing for the middle class and middle class neighborhoods. You see better diets for these people as well. And you also see the social structure being maintained and being much healthier, as in most cases, the middle class, you don't see the women working. The children definitely aren't working. And you have a growing part of society that is at least doing fairly well. They're not rich, but they're at least doing somewhat well. However, there is one negative within this. There ultimately, over time, the middle class, mainly from the views of both the upper and primarily the lower class, are going to be viewed as poor and lazy and or ignorant and responsible for their own misery, because in terms of the upper classes, they look down on them, and the lower classes look up at them and are very jealous under the circumstances. All right, some political effects of the revolution, and we'll talk more about these, capitalism and socialism, and how similar and different they are. But remember, we've already talked about capitalism a little bit, but individuals are starting to control the factors of production. So land, labor, and capital. Businesses are privately owned. Socialism is where government owns the means of production and operates them on behalf of the people. So you have these two competing systems and different groups, and there's going to be movements that arise in various places throughout Europe, whether it's in England or Germany or other places that go off of these ideas, and they conflict. And there's going to be some revolutions that we'll talk about later on in this unit that deals with this, the differences between these two. And you see unions and antitrust laws created and reform movements take place because of these movements and because of the Industrial Revolution. All right, so we're almost done. The question is how would we rate the Industrial Revolution? Is it good? Is it bad? Or is it somewhere in between? Do we actually know? So was the Industrial Revolution a blessing or a curse? Well, there are a lot of negatives and there are a lot of positives. A negative is that you have low pay and unemployment becomes more prevalent in some areas, and people are forced to move into horrible living conditions, and there is a need for reform because of these negatives. And this, that's not even all of them. We've talked about many others, such as disease and the family unit and social constructs getting torn apart. The positives are we see new industries take form, new ways of producing, more efficient ways of producing things. You see more jobs. Over time, you see wages rise, and travel and communication and transportation increases. You start to see people's worlds or horizons widen from their just local area to maybe more of a country or even worldly area. And you see opportunities increase for everyone, or not everyone, but most people across at least Europe at this time. And over time, you generally see conditions improve. All right, so just two slides left here. There are some important inventions and inventors for you guys to remember for the Industrial Revolution. I'm not going to go through all of these right here by just reading what's off screen. You guys can pause the video and take a look at it. We will review each of these and talk about all of them at a later date, but please pause this and take a little bit of time to at least look at what some of these inventions and important people were during the Industrial Revolution. And then lastly here, kind of a cause and effect. And I would also pause this, and I want you to take a look. This is some of the stuff that we've already talked about, some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about moving through this unit, and then some stuff that we're going to be talking about in the next unit and moving forward. So you have the Industrial Revolution, and there's some justifications. You have 19th century liberalism and social Darwinism that we're going to talk about here moving forward. And that leads to some responses to it, such as socialism, Marxism, and labor unions. Again, stuff that we're going to talk about here in this unit later on. And you see social changes. Aristocracy has a declining power base. You see middle classes rising up. You see the working class living in poverty and peasants struggling to survive. Again, we've talked about this already. We're going to talk more about this moving forward. From an urban industrial environment, we see the expansion of government services to people, as well as facilitation to businesses. You see city services develop, such as fire, police, water, and sanitation. And you also see public health and education movements throughout this century as the Industrial Revolution moves on and we get closer to the 1900s and the 20th century. You also see finance capitalism. Okay, where you have these new markets, investments, and all these raw materials financing this increase in capitalism globally. And what this does is it actually leads to increased competition and all these other factors, whether it's these social changes and these environments developed for urban industry and these capitalistic ideas and these resources and this competition leads to nationalistic movements and then ultimately imperialism and colonialism, and then a building of militarism, which leads to an entangling system of alliances, which ultimately leads to World War One. But that's for a later date. We'll talk more about that and connect these in the future. All right, guys, have a good one.